Right. Well, welcome everyone to the Armor Roundtable, a part of the Worcester Art Museum Give-a-thon, which is a virtual fundraising drive to support the museum as we look forward to brighter days ahead. My name's Elie Hutchinson, and I am delighted to be joined by 6 members of the Higgins Armory team to basically geek about armor for the next hour of your afternoon. And we'll discuss arms and armor, history, and what it's like to work with the second largest collection of medieval arms and armor in the United States. If you have a question for us, put it in the comments below and we'll do our best to answer. Now, if you enjoy our talk, I hope you'll consider making a gift today. The link is in the video description, and patrons Jim and Carol Donnelly have announced that they will generously match all gifts up to $5,000 between now and 6 p.m. So we hope you'll help us maintain the momentum to allow the museum to continue to exhibit and care for this amazing collection. So let's jump right in and we'll meet our knights, or rather nerds, of the round table. And let's go ahead and we'll start with Dr. Jeffrey Forgang. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Jeffrey Forgang, and I am the Higgins Curator of Arms and Armor at the Worcester Art Museum.
All right, let's continue and go ahead with Bill.
I'm Bill McMillan. I'm the conservator of Arms and Armor at the Worcester Art Museum.
Neil.
My name is Neil Bourbeau, and I am the programming coordinator for the education department at the Art Museum.
Lestra.
I'm Lestra Atlas. I'm one of the Arms and Armor interns.
Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Parikh. I'm the assistant curator of Asian and Middle Eastern art, also at the Worcester Art Museum.
And Natasha.
I'm Natasha Mao. I'm the interpretive fellow for the Higgins collection at WAM.
I guess I'll introduce myself too. Why am I here when I am not a WAM person? Well, I am definitely a friend of WAM. Happy to support the mission. And I'm also a runner of a brand called Lorica Clothing, where I make clothes that look like armor. That is part of why I'm part of this armor nerd conversation and kind of helping to facilitate today. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about, perhaps for those unfamiliar, what is the Higgins collection? And maybe a little bit about the history, how it's sort of partnered with WAM in today's day and age.
Sure. The Higgins collection was founded by John Woodman Higgins. He was a Worcester industrialist specializing in steel. And he decided in about 1926 that he wanted to found a museum that would be on the campus of his steel factory. And it would be it would focus on the art of steel in the past as well as in the present. He opened the museum in 1931, and it was active from the 30s until 2013. Shut down at the end of 2013. The economic downturn of 2008 really hit a lot of nonprofits quite hard, and we just weren't sustainable. But the collection, as well as a number of the staff, including myself, Bill, and Neil, came to the Worcester Art Museum, where we have been working to create a permanent Arms and Armor display, a gallery dedicated to the Higgins collection. And in the meantime, we have a good deal of Arms and Armor out on the galleries, about 100 objects of various types in our medieval galleries, as well as distributed elsewhere throughout the building.
Excellent. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what each of y'all do, sort of like a day in the life at the museum. And maybe, Jeff, you can start us off since you're sort of curator of the whole collection.
Yeah, well, actually, to give you a pretty typical example might be today. I spent this morning working on the catalog essay to go with a touring exhibition of Arms and Armor that is going to launch later this year. So basically generating the book text that will form the meat of this catalog. And then that was working remotely, as for the most part, as so many of us are these days, but also somewhat on site for things that I can't do from my home office. And therefore, later in the day, I came to the Art Museum to meet up with Bill McMillan, where we were discussing plans for our are mannequins that we will be sending both on tour with this exhibition, as well as some of the mannequins that we're going to need to juggle around in various locations within WAM's own displays. And the mannequinning in arms and armor is kind of one of the really complicated things about these objects compared to other museum objects. When you're putting a painting on the wall, there's very few variables that you really have to deal with, sort of, vertical and horizontal, and that's pretty much all you really have to worry about, compared to a suit of armor, which has to have a mannequin. It's got a certain size. It's got to carry, typically 60 plus pounds of weight on it. You want it to have something of a kind of animation to it, an appearance that might suggest something of the historical context, whether only in kind of sketched out or in depth. And all of that has to be done within budget, within practical means, and so on. And that's why there's a close collaboration between myself and Bill. I'm kind of coming to it more from the historical side of knowing the objects. Bill is the person who has the more of the kind of physical, hands-on experience of how the objects need to be handled and displayed in physical terms. And so there's that ongoing dialogue between the two of us. Gives you something of an idea of the sorts of things a curator does.
Well, let's go hand it off to Bill as part of that partnership.
Yeah, got to work with Jeffrey again today. It's always, especially with COVID, it's always nice to be able to have face-to-face conversations about the pieces. A typical day for me is right now treatments. We have a lot of pieces getting ready to go out on the touring exhibit, and also the pieces being prepared for the permanent installation in the galleries. So most of my day is spent either doing treatments on objects or in meetings or reviewing paperwork for potential loans. A lot of work recently on the mannequins, like Jeffrey was saying, and that involves both in-house meetings and reaching out to colleagues. When we first started discussing the mannequins, I reached out to my colleagues at the Met for information they did, and they were wonderful with passing along research and information they had, and then just incorporating what I can into the care and maintenance of the collection. I describe my job as holding back the ocean with a broom. There's always something more that needs to get taken care of, always another piece that needs to get addressed. It's a living collection, so it always needs care and upkeep. So every day is just another facet of making sure the collection is in the best condition as possible and is preserved for as long as we can.
It's quite a task. Well, let's go ahead and turn it over to the third member of our OG Higgins Triumvirate, which should be Neil.
All right. So I'm the programming coordinator, so I work within the education department, and I'm a transplant, of course, from the Higgins Armory. So one of the reasons I got hired on was, of course, the fact that I was someone who basically did work and continues to work educating the public about arms and armor. So kind of the public face of basically the Higgins team, I guess. And essentially, a lot of it's working with a variety, well, in non-COVID times, school groups, doing a lot of presentations about armor, including hands-on demonstrations, also public demonstrations, which we are continuing currently on Facebook Live. We're live tomorrow at 11:30, so stay tuned for that. And of course, we do hands-on activities in the galleries as drop-in activities for the public as well. And of course, I do non-armor related things too, but these days mostly it's armor stuff. Writing texts and material for our social media posts for Facebook and for Instagram. Plus we do WAM updates, our internal blog, written a few of those. So basically kind of translating the material to the public. So I spend a lot of my time answering questions that the public has to ask. So this will be nothing new for me tonight.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and turn it over to our other members of the team. Let's say, Natasha, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Natasha Mount again. I am the interpretive fellow. I work closely with Jeffrey Fergain. A typical day in my work. Let's see. So before and after COVID, there's definitely a difference. I did quite a lot of visitor evaluation in person before COVID, which now has to be moved to online. But you know, I really enjoy the process, whether it's online or in person. I really love talking to visitors. So in person, it would be, you know, a fun experience. But online, we actually got to collect a lot of response from more diverse range of online visitors that we otherwise would not have gathered the data from. So that's a big part. Another part would be social media now that after COVID, we will like to continue to engage our audience with our social media content. So yeah, so I supervise a group of interns with Jeffrey Fergain to generate social media content, and we have our weekly meetings and sometimes daily meetings to continue to improve posts as well as videos. So these videos are on our YouTube channel. If you have not checked out yet, Higgins Armory Collection, we have it's a playlist within the Worcester Art Museum channel. So check that out. We have object highlights and everything. So yeah, that's another big part. And in addition to that, lots of, I have a lot of administrative tasks, which I actually really enjoyed. Going through collection database and make sure they're in good condition. That's what I also enjoy very much. And yeah, so that would be a typical day, but you know, it's never typical because for museums, we are very flexible about what we do. And I really enjoy that aspect as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing your experience. So a couple members of the team haven't been part of the team sort of in the before time, so they'll kind of have an extra interesting experience to share. So let's turn it over to Rachel first.
Yeah, I actually started my position as assistant curator of Asian and Middle Eastern art right before the pandemic. I was supposed to come out to Worcester on March 14th, and the museum closed on the 13th. So I think I spent about 5 days in total at the museum and have been in my hometown of Chicago since. And it's been interesting in terms of the challenges. Like, for example, I have not been able to physically work with my collection. I just see it virtually. So sometimes I'm like, I will see you one day. And a lot of my colleagues I have not met in person. A lot of them I've met in Zoom. And I've known Bill and Jeffrey before I started at WAM, so they're probably like, oh, thank God she's not here. But it's been interesting. My typical day has just been really working on cataloging my collection, which comprises of a little over 9,000 objects from the Middle East and all over Asia, and spans from ancient to contemporary. So it's a pretty big chunk of our overall collection. And I'm currently developing an exhibition on South Asian arms and armor at the Royal Courts of India, and working with Bill, Jeffrey, and Natasha on a case in our Japanese gallery that will look at kind of general objects of Japanese arms and armor. So there's a lot of exciting things, but I'm really itching to get into the museum, hopefully soon.
As we all are, grabby hands for all
Yes,
those
grabby
objects. All right, well, last but not least, let's hear from Lestra.
So my experience is like a extreme version of Rachel's, in that I'm ashamed to say I've never been to the Worcester Art Museum or to the Higgins. I've always, yeah, I know, don't look like that, Bill.
We judged you long ago.
I know, it's fine. And I've grown up in Boston my entire life and never heard of it, which is wild because I love the Middle Ages. And so for me, I've never seen the layout of the Higgins or really seen any of these objects, like Rachel said, that I'm looking at on the online catalog like every day. So that's sad. And one day I will get to see all these objects in person, and I look forward to that day. But in the meantime, I've been working really closely with Natasha and Jeffrey on social media development. So writing posts, writing and developing videos for both social media for the touring exhibition and the permanent exhibition. And so that's been really fun because I get to do a lot of research into really interesting objects and then share them with the social media audiences, which has been really rewarding and really fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for kind of sharing a little bit about your jobs. And I guess we'll kind of dive into why are you where you are? Why are we all armor nerds? Like, what is this? What is the appeal of armor, and kind of how did it come into your consciousness? I don't really want to call on anyone for this, but if you have a story to share, some what flash of shining steel really like changed your life and made you pursue this, right?
I'm a classic nerd. So basically it started the same year. It was, I think I was about 12, discovered two things. It was J.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. And then I was like, what the hell is chainmail? Because I had no idea anything about armor. So that started me down that path. And I haven't stopped.
I'm very similar. I opened my brother's monster manual. I think it was 3rd edition, and it was all downhill from there. Like, people were like, "Oh, why did you decide to make clothes that look like armor?" And I'm like, "I play D&D. I don't know what else to tell you." But I think a lot of us could probably agree that like maybe an encounter with pop culture or literature was what really sparked this romance for the Middle Ages. What else do you guys want to say on that?
Yeah, for me, it could have been Howard Pyle's Robin Hood, which remains one of my favorite medieval stories. And I remember going to one of my parents took me to one of the first ever Renaissance fairs back out in California in the olden times. And first year I went there, I was really disappointed because I was like everybody else had costumes and I didn't, and I was very, very upset. Following year, I made my mom craft a Robin Hood costume for me, and the year after that, I actually got some cardboard and spray paint, and I made myself a suit of armor.
Wow, awesome.
Yeah, for me, it was the 19th century historical revivalism, so pre-Raphaelites, Victorian paintings. I study Renaissance art, so like I always love how 19th century people look at it, and that's where it started.
And for me, oh yeah, no, go Bill.
I was going to say mine was a perfect combination of read a Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, and then went to the Higgins Armory Museum that same summer, and it was all downhill from there.
For me, I've always been interested in the Middle Ages, but I'm also really into crafting and historical crafts specifically. And so one day I was like, I've heard about chainmail. I bet I could do that. And so I sat down and taught myself how to make chainmail. And that was kind of it for me with armor.
I feel like I'm an imposter. You can boot me off of this, by the way. So mine came much later in life. It was actually after I finished my PhD. I specialized in South Asian painting, and I had a postdoc at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I also have severe magpie syndrome. So there was a sword in the gallery that is it's bejeweled, it's covered in gold and diamonds, so super casual. And I was like, I had a Gollum, my precious moment. And I was like, this is it for me. And I think I'll admit that I was a total hypocrite in thinking that arms and armor is only used for combat and violence. And there's so much more than that. And I think that's what I love about this field, is that it continuously challenges those misconceptions, and that they can be admired for their beauty and their craftsmanship. So you'll often find me with my face against glass and drooling all over really pretty, shiny arms and armor.
And I'd sort of love to dig into that a little bit, just because kind of based on the Higgins social recently, but armor is fashion and always has been. It's always been aesthetics mixed with like practical martial purpose, right? I think a lot of people I'm not casting aspersions on any particular hobby, but a lot of people who go into kind of interest in armor from a practitioner standpoint, from like, I'm going to go fence, I'm going to go fight in armor, sort of forget that like armor is art component and look at it purely as military technology. And I think there's really something lost there when you don't consider that it has always been creating a story about the wearer as much as it has been defending him on the field, right? Bill, were you going to add, or did I cut you off at a bad time?
It's interesting because you talk about the, those people who are, the military people who are very practical, and it's the utilitarian, but you ask any one of them and they've got a favorite sword.
Oh, yeah.
It's got the perfect shape and it fits real well in the hand. And fencers are very particular about what mask they wear and, the clothing, and they don't want to admit it, but they're as much into the artistry and the fashion of it as anybody else, but they just phrase it in a different way. It's not the artistry, it's the craftsmanship, which is artistry with a different name.
I think too that one of the big challenges for modern people understanding armor is the change in our understanding of masculinity. There's a certain point in history, like around 1920, early 1900s, shall we say, where when men's clothing went drab. But prior to that time, men were if anything, the peacocks. They dressed more outlandishly, more colorfully, more richly than the women, if anything. It was and that was very, very much true in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And the armor was clothing for the battlefield, and they expected their battlefield clothing to look as good as their civilian clothing did. And that's something that, I mean, in a lot of ways, we've kind of lost touch with that. But I think it's crucial to understanding how they viewed armor.
I think it's a reflection of the transition from a pre-mass production industrial world to an industrial world. It's like when you first start at the beginning of industrialization, things that can be mass produced tend to be utilitarian first. And so you see a separation from decorative things from practical everyday things. And I think that's been something that is permeating a lot of how people see things. People have a hard time seeing something as being both decorative and practical. And that it could be in both those lines. It's something I think we're finally returning to in the last 20, 30 years or so. But I think for a long time in industrialization, just, if you wanted something that's decorative, that was a whole separate thing. It was beyond what you needed to have.
I see William Morris going through Natasha's head.
Yeah, he's my favorite. He's my favorite.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm especially taken by that point on masculinity, especially since in a lot of modern reconstructions of the Middle Ages in film and in writing, and everything is covered in mud, it's brown, everybody's wearing like a barrel-shaped cuirass, you know what I mean? Like everything about it is, it's a modern cosplay of the past that's kind of trying to ignore the parts that they don't like, right? Like the wasp waists, the super tight hosen, because calves were how you judge whether a man is fine, right? And just things like that are sort of Rachel's dying over there. Like lost to time.
I'm trying really hard not to lose it, but that's perfect.
I just think it's so interesting how you can, there's so many sources on this. There's so many illustrations where you can see, or even looking at Maximilian's amazing Gothic suit, where the man had like a 23-inch waist, and we're still casting these old like brutish Viking dudes in all these films, and I just find that fascinating. But I guess that we can kind of transition there. Like, what is the relevance of armor in pop culture? Is it just that, I mean, we have this romanticization of the Middle Ages where we still want to see movies like The King. We want yet another Joan of Arc movie. You know what I mean? Like, there's just still this I confess it myself, just like this love of this era. So what maybe aesthetically appeals to us about it, or what is it, like the sense of nobility and valor and things like that? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a lot of the idealized version of what we think of as knights as opposed to what it actually was. You know, the image in our head is so much more black and white than what the reality was. You know, we've got that Knights of the Round Table and chivalry, and you know, we'll take out the mud and the blood and the backstabbing and you know the plagues and you know that sort of thing. We want that nice, clean, sterilized, pretty version. I think that's what captivates people, is that fantasy. You know, and it continues on. You know, movies and video games and you know graphic novels and even Renaissance fairs. You know, Neil Gaiman had a great comment about, you know, one of the immortals talking about going to a Renaissance fair, and he said, you know, there's not enough crap here. That's what everybody forgets. You know, maybe they should spray the visitors when they walk in. And it's true. You know, we take all the crap out of it, and we're left with that shiny armor ideal. And I think that's, you know, we romanticize the past all the time. I don't think it's unique for arms and armor. I think it's just we do that across the board.
Although I think there's a flip side to it, because I think on a lot of, you know, you look at shows like Vikings and stuff like that, sometimes they go to the opposite extreme a little bit too much, where there's too much dirt and grime and everything's black, brown, or gray. You know, one of the things I like to think and remind people of is, you know, the Middle Ages was very colorful, and same with the ancient world too. I mean, we have this kind of very stilted image of how things looked back then sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to totally agree with Neil. It's the depictions of the Middle Ages in popular culture are either completely romanticized or dark and violent and horrible. And so there's not really that in between that takes from both sides and sort of depicts a more complex and fully formed world like the past was.
Like being sensationalized, like Game of Thrones. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to say about the Game of Thrones is like the death rate amongst the characters is right, but the methodology is wrong.
Not enough people dying of dysentery.
Exactly.
What Game of Thrones needs.
More gout.
Yeah. Well, Cersei and Sean Bean are in this other movie called, I think, Black Death. I think it's on Amazon Prime, so I haven't checked it out yet, but it's supposed to be fairly gore.
Too soon to watch anything about plagues for me.
Of course, you know, people have been romanticizing the past for as long, pretty much as they've had a notion that there was a past. You know, you look at, say, you know, the Epic of Homer, looking back at the great heroes of previous, you know, centuries, and you know, even, I mean, the arms and armor was romanticized. Already in the Middle Ages, and in fact, in a lot of ways, like tournaments were the original Renaissance fair. I mean, they're dressing up, they're doing various kind of play acting, they're evoking the past of sort of the you know, thinking about King Arthur many centuries earlier. If you read Mallory's account of the you know, version of the Arthurian story, I mean, it's set in kind of the trappings of the late 1400s, but very much an idealized chivalric past, even at a time when people were actually wearing these armors, and there were actually knights, and there were orders of chivalry, and so on. So to me, in a lot of ways, that's what's especially fascinating about armor in particular, is that this is it's kind of, I mean, they're real objects, they're practical objects, they're designed to be very functional on the battlefield. You know, most of the armor that you'll see, even if it's highly decorated, is built to battlefield quality. But the people who were wearing this stuff and making it and looking at it and so on, they were looking at it. It was practical. It had to be practical. It had to be serviceable. But they were thinking King Arthur. When a knight during the Wars of the Roses was putting all this gear on, but prior to a battle, he kind of had those the heroes of Mallory's legend in his head. Actually, I should take a moment to welcome anybody who has joined us since we started half an hour ago. Welcome to the new Knights of the modern round table. We're the Higgins Collection Team, talking about arms and armor and the Higgins Collection, and hosted by the splendid Elie Hutchinson of Lorica Clothing, a sample of which she's actually wearing this evening. Awesome piece of kit, I gotta say. We're taking questions from the audience. Send something in a comment, and don't forget also that you can support the museum and its programs by donating to the link that you'll see in the video description. And we actually have a 1-for-1 match active until 6 p.m. this evening.
So while we're talking about misconceptions, let's get into a few audience questions here. So we have a question from Simon. Perhaps you could explain why chainmail is a modern, inaccurate term, and why 19th century historians use the name, and how mail armor isn't actually made of chains. Clearly, Simon has an opinion about this. So let's dig into it, shall we?
Well, of course, yeah, naturally, Simon has an opinion about it. He's one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on the subject of armor. Well, yeah, I mean, if you really want to get the sort of fingernails on a blackboard effect for an arms and armor nerd, use the term chainmail, and you'll get an instant response out of them. The expression is a 19th century creation, as Simon mentions, and it's sort of part and parcel of the 1800s was a time when they were trying to figure out how arms and armor worked in the Middle Ages, and very little actual armor survives from the Middle Ages. Prior to 1400, scarcely any to speak of, and so they and still we in many ways are reliant on illustrations to help us understand what they actually wore on the battlefield. And in the 1800s, based on their reading of medieval manuscript illustrations, they sort of came up with all these different variants on mail, chain mail, scale mail, banded mail, ring mail, studded mail, all this sort of stuff. And a lot of it really didn't even exist at all, and a lot of it was kind of a misnomer. Mail, by definition, means what is popularly understood as by chainmail. It's that mesh of interlocked iron links, and so mail is mail, and that all mail is that sort of interlocked links of iron. So the scale mail, it isn't a thing. There is scale armor and there is mail armor, but there really isn't such a thing as scale mail. So it is definitely a way to tell how much arms and armor reading a person has done, and how much time they spent in the arms and armor community, which term they use. On the other hand, I as somebody who talks to the public about armor, mail is a challenging word because it's a really short word. It has a lot of homonyms, and it can be a little bit unfamiliar to general audiences. For some time, sometimes I will use the term sort of chainmail, throw it in as an alternate to mail, just to help orient people if I'm speaking in public, although I tend nowadays more to rely on the term mail armor, which I hope is mostly understood by people the same way that they understand chainmail.
Let's get a little deeper into this question of kind of going back to our discussion on media. Dale asks, As you've become experts in your field and your knowledge has expanded, how has that changed your feelings toward arms and armor and media? Are there books, movies, TV, etc. that you once enjoyed that you just can no longer stand, or ones you've grown to love even more? Do you have a guilty pleasure? So I think we've talked about how guts and grime and rusty armor. No, no, no. Brown and black and gray and no color. No, no, no. What else can we, what bothers us personally, as we'll soon discover, giant swords in video games. I'm like, not practical, guys. Like, I know anime is a little different for me. I'll allow some hyperbole there, but when you're trying to do this like gritty, realistic medieval setting and you just have like a 7-foot long, 50-pound sword, I don't buy it. But
Right. Yeah, I gotta say, for myself, you know, one of the things I say to a lot of people, you just can't go to Hollywood for history. You know, basically, if you want history, you got to go to a museum, got to read a book, or nowadays go to the internet, and even that's dangerous sometimes. But you know, movies like Braveheart, you know, historically, that's about as accurate as. Yeah, it's not, but it's a really good movie as a movie, and that's one of the things that's interesting about it. And in some ways, even though these things are made with a ton of inaccuracies, one of the things they do is because they do have that cool factor and get people into them, people who don't know, it gets them interested and it starts them on the road to that process of learning that, oh wow, there was actually a bridge at the Battle of Stirling Bridge that wasn't there in the movie Braveheart, and should have been. They discover the errors along the way, but a lot of people would never even bother to look at it if they hadn't seen the movie in the first place. So it's a good bridge to getting people into the thing, even though in and of itself isn't necessarily correct. So we can still have fun with it.
I think for me, it's a combination of a guilty pleasure, but also I can't stand it. It's Game of Thrones. I love it.
all of our hearts.
I know, but hear me out. Hear me out. The last season, I don't want to talk about it, but before that, amazing. But the one thing that drove me absolutely insane was, why didn't Jaime Lannister have a pata, a gauntlet sword? That would have been perfect. And it drives me crazy. I still, every time I see any scene with Jaime Lannister, I'm like, all he needed was a gauntlet sword. A pata. That's all he needed.
We have historical precedent for getting around this problem. They even had like prosthetics in the Middle Ages. Like, you don't have to be, you know.
Exactly. And when I was little, Willow was my favorite movie, along with Princess Bride. But Willow, I think my mom had to buy like 3 VHS tapes. That shows how old I am. But Val Kilmer had a pata in Willow. So I'm like, if he could have it, Jaime Lannister certainly could have too. So that's my gripe, but also my guilty pleasure. We'll totally watch all those seasons except for the last one in a heartbeat.
Well, I have a little bit of a game we can play. It is a roast and toast of some arms and armor in video games. All of us tent our fingers and mustaches curl. But let us talk about the Weapons in Demon's Souls, which is a video game roughly based on, very, very roughly based on fantasy Middle Ages. Let me see if I can operate technology to share my screen. The question all of us ask whenever any of us share anything. Can y'all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So I welcome you all to our first episode of Higgins Experts React to Video Game Weapons. I will preface this by saying none of us have played Demon's Souls. So don't come for us if we get anything wrong about the game, or if there's certain lore reasons things are the way they are. We're going to approach it specifically from a historical expert perspective. And to that note, like, in fantasy, I'm not that mad if things are a little extra. You know, it is art, and in real life as well, armor was an artistic medium for expression, right? So I'll allow that before we spill some blood about these weapons, shall we? So let's go to our first page. We have to start with swords. That's where all good things begin. So let's go right into swords. What do we think about these? I'm like, not that mad about the length on these, but I will say that they seem a bit chonky to my somewhat amateurish fencer eye. What do y'all have to say about it?
The screen hasn't changed.
Yeah,
for
I
me.
can't
Does not
see
change.
anything.
No. Does
No,
it
Wish I
share?
could
What if
see
I
them.
what if I press this button? No? Yes? It says sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. I shall. How about? Ooh, technical
Technology.
difficulties.
Welcome to the world of COVID.
I know. It was going so well. Okay, let's see. How about now? Yes?
There we go.
Yes.
Awesome.
Hooray! I'm not going to try to full screen it because that seems to have been my downfall last time. So here we go. Let's talk about these.
Oh,
One of the things that's really interesting about all of these is that they've got this honking great grip and a rather undersized blade, which so why? Because like in fact we have this fabulous Celtic sort of bronze sword in our collection, and people always think, oh, the grip's so small, and you know, but actually when you pick the thing up, it just like when you grip it, it just locks right into your hand. Like for a one-handed sword, you want you actually want a nice short grip that's going to make it solid in your hand. Here they've got like a grip for two-handed use, but the blade just doesn't measure up.
I'm also interested in this sword that is called Mail Breaker.
Yeah.
Do swords break chainmail? Tell me, experts. Or can you design a sword to be better at breaking chainmail than others? I don't really discern why this guy would be any better than, say, the guy next to him.
I mean, having something with a very acute point and a diamond-shaped blade with some rigidity has got a better chance of maybe punching into mail if it hits a really bad link or something, or a really strong thrust. But yeah, that's about it. I would give it too much more credibility, and the thing is, the point on that's pretty fat, so it's not going to go too far.
Right.
Yeah, and if you're gonna be trying to hit someone with mail armor, you don't necessarily want a sword. You might want a crushing weapon instead.
Yeah.
Also, here's a word of advice. If you're ever actually going to be in a sword fight, do not choose the knight sword. Just a little insider hint. That is not what you want to be going into a life and death situation with. It would totally, like if your job is, if your goal is to turn heads at court, that's probably a great piece of bling to be wearing at your side. But as a rule, when you're looking at a weapon, the harder it's trying to impress you, the less impressed you actually need to be by it.
all I could think of when I saw the knight sword was our theatrical sword that we
Yes.
have in the collection,
Yes, totally.
which has the giant lion head pommel, and it's all gessoed and gilt and all that. And it's like, it's got a real blade, but you're really not going to want to try and fight with it. But it looks really cool.
So Jeffrey,
Right,
which one would you choose for yourself?
I'm trying to get a better look at the points, but the longsword is actually fairly plausible. I mean, I would prefer a longsword with a longer blade than that, and maybe a little bit on the chunky side, but and the grip is longer than it really needs to be for fighting. But that one, of all of these, it's the one that comes closest. Like that short sword on the top left hand side, like it's got a grip for two hands, but if you're using it with two hands, it means that your second hand is on the pommel. That pommel is not well shaped to slide around in your secondary hand as you're executing complex techniques with both hands on the weapon. So basically, with a sword, as a rule, like less is more. Use the kind of the minimum you need in order to get the job done.
Right. So let's go to our page 2 of swords, because there are many swords in this game. So
wow.
I call these the odd boppers because they're just kind of strange shapes and sizes. Though I think the falchion is okay, right? Like there were swords of that shape in history.
Yeah, it's a little bit turned up, but you know, up to 11. But it's like a,
Yeah.
but it is like a. It's actually not unlike the Conyers falchion.
Yeah, pretty close to almost realistic.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were taking broadsword perhaps a little too literally.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the
Yeah.
proper shape for such a broadsword? Like just take it in Photoshop and go, and probably shorten the hilt as we've discussed before.
Yeah, shorter hilt and not quite so broad.
And this
Again,
blue butt
very
sword sort
short.
of looks like a one-handed lance is kind of what I'm getting, the vibe I'm getting from it.
Totally.
Yeah, I was confused by
Yeah.
that one.
All right. Well, we've got many more to go. So let's go on to very large swords, which I think is a literal in-game classification. But video game nerds, you can come for me on that one. Okay, so we've got a lot of very large swords. So
I love these so much.
Oh my gosh.
It's like we're
I
going
get
into
mad about the
battle.
Flagebird, actually. I
Yeah.
feel like the Flagebird is exactly fine. The other ones are highly questionable. And I'd also love to hear your take on the historicity of like casually having a baseball bat of a sword on your shoulder. Like, was
Right?
that ever a thing? Like, are there sources for this position? Because you see it in anime, you see it in video games, and I'm like, but why?
The position I think is okay as far as resting a great sword, which wouldn't be quite so great as these. You see that in some of the period art, them resting it on their shoulders. So that's actually not
Okay.
wrong. The rest of these look more like bearing swords, which we do have one, rather than actual great swords.
I was going to say, it looks like they're going into battle with our bearing sword, and I can't imagine getting more than one swing out of that before you fall over.
Yeah, so we actually, as the folks have been saying, we actually have a sword which is similar in dimension to these. It's rather simpler in its design, but it is purely a ceremonial weapon. This is, you know, like this is something that you would definitely not want to be carrying into battle, because it's just, you know, it's just like putting a sign on your back says, "Please kill me."
But we do have textual evidence for very, very big swords like montantes and that sort of thing, right? But how is that weapon perhaps different from these? It's definitely not as broad. While very long, it is perhaps not this long. And these are monster hilts. Like that hilt is easily like 30% of the sword, which I don't think is historical. But what are your thoughts? Because there are big weapons.
There are larger swords, and I mean the Montante is about as large as I mean the two-handed the Zweihänder, the German Zweihänder is also, you know, quite large, and it would have been carried like some, you know, along these lines, probably by somebody who's on the kind of larger side. So large swords do exist, just not as big as these ones are shown. And as you were saying, the grips are like they're insanely long.
All right, I think we have another page of very large swords. These ones I put on the same page because he has amazing wrist strength. That's all I could say. I know he's a demon slayer, but he's got amazing forearms if he can just hold this like 6 foot long thing. But yeah, what do we think?
Well, it's interesting because the S-Tuck that's here is actually a type of sword that was designed to break mail. And that actually is fairly close. It might be a little bit too broad because it was a lot of them were really just kind of like a point on the end of a long, like a 3 foot long haft, or 3 foot long blade rather. So that's almost close, although it looks a little bit on the long side.
How much do those pommels weigh that he's got such balance with it?
Right, he's just like perfectly holding it parallel to the ground, and I'm like, my 3 pound longsword already feels heavy to me, so I don't know.
Well, if you make the pommel out of lead, then maybe you get the...
It's almost like they need to take all the sword and scale them back to like 2/3 their actual, 2/3 the size to get them the right scale. The proportionality is really off.
All right, so we're moving from the realm of swords to the realm of rapiers, which are slightly different swords. So I know Jeff is a practitioner, so I would particularly love his thoughts. But I don't know. These also just seem a little too broad, but maybe I'm too used to modern fencing swords, which are like foils and things like that my brain is skewed. But what do the experts think?
I mean, the blade at the top right is quite plausible. The hilt is kind of oversized. They really do seem to go for the oversized hilts in this design series, which is it's definitely not a direction you want to go. For a real fighting weapon, you don't want to carry more weight than is actually necessary. So these things were would be made to minimize the quantity of steel that you're actually forced to fight with.
I mean, if you're gonna have all those extra points and spikes on your gauntlet, you really need the oversized hilt just to accommodate it.
I was about to say he has twice the size of a normal hand, so maybe he needs twice the sword. But do we have any precedent for the spiral rapier, like any of these twisty?
I know. I was
like
thinking about that. That's really kind of curious.
Yeah, I don't get that
cool,
one.
I wonder if it's a riff off of the quote unquote flaming swords, where you've got the movement hammered into the blade to kind of mimic the flaming sword at the gates of Eden. But just I can't imagine trying to forge that.
Well, I think it just looks like a little bit of a blacksmith's twist on a square stock. It's so more decorative than functional.
Interesting. Well, let us go forward because I know we have lots of questions and also cool things to talk about. Daggers, quick take. What do we think about these daggers? I don't know what makes the secret dagger that much more secret. That's my only take.
It doesn't look very secret, too.
Yeah.
The secret of the secret dagger is it's just an old Bowie knife.
Yeah, right.
All right, let's go on to more daggers.
What disappoints me about all of these is that there are so many other cooler, like, daggers and short swords that you could have used. It's almost like they went for the pedestrian on this. Like, get into the Nepalese knives or some of the the Congo region, with the throwing knives or the ceremonial daggers. Like, those have these awesome curves and reverse spikes. And I mean, if you're going to go for fantasy, that you're pretending to root in history, there's so many cool pieces out there that you could have gone with. I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, daggers,
Maces. These, I feel like the shape is right, just minimized by like 30%.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
Those would be hard than the rest.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I don't know about these axes though. Maybe the
That
battle axe
guillotine.
is fine, but the great axe is like okay, the guillotine axe is literally you took the guillotine and you put it on a stick.
And not like this long a stick.
All right, let's go pole arms. These I'm not as mad at, honestly. Maybe the blades are a little bit too big.
Still a little bit on the biggish side for the blades, but the basic concepts are pretty
Kind of
much
remind me of those Italian pole arms we have with the oversized.
blades.
Yeah.
We have a pair of ceremonial glaives from Venice, and the heads are it's a different shape than the ones you see on screen, but they're but similar kind of dimensions. But these were purely ceremonial pieces. I mean, they look good. They're visible from a distance, visible in a crowd. Which these objects, you could imagine these things being carried in a ceremonial context, but yeah, not so much in a serious fight.
Right. What about these spears? Do you feel like this is our last page before we jump back into questions? The short spear is a shovel. I will say that. I feel like the war scythe is okay though. Like I've seen these Kriegszeichel at the German National Museum in Berlin, and they look very similar.
It's not so far off, actually.
you
And
know,
that, that spear, you said it was called the short spear. I can't see on my screen
Yeah.
how it's titled, but I mean, the head is a little bit on the large side, but other than that, kind of plausible. And I think there's a good reason to believe that a lot of these sort of larger headed spears were designed for slashing as well as thrusting.
mhm.
So a little bit of meat behind the head would make some sense. The
Now,
winged spear, there is such a thing as a winged spear, but it's not quite as wingy as that one is.
that war sigh, it reminds me of some of the French Revolution sighs where they, hammered out the plowshares to kind of cobble together a pole arm. It's get that almost like, oh, we're just going to jam this on a big stick and go and poke somebody
Yeah, I
sort of
mean,
feel to it.
the blade looks exactly like a scythe blade. It's just just take it and put it to align with a spear shaft, and that's all you need to do. So,
Yeah.
Not enough
Awesome.
bling on it.
not playing-
All right. Well, I'm glad we could bond over that experience. But we've got a lot of audience questions, so let's hop on in. Let me see. I know we had some good questions that were general, how does armor work questions. So Ben asks, how do you wear armor? How does it attach to the person? Like, are there straps? Are there like knots? What kind of attachments are we talking about? Because it feels like, as a layperson who hasn't delved into this world, it's very mysterious how the inside of the armor works, as opposed to, the beautiful decoration. So our experts, what shall you say?
Well, Neil's the one who wears armor more often than any of us, so
True.
it seems like a question for Neil.
So yeah, I mean, really underneath what you don't see is the fact that you're going to be wearing an arming jacket underneath, or doublet, depending on your verbiage. And one of the things it has are laces called points, which would actually be pieces where you would lace things like the upper parts of the arm defense to the tops of the thigh pieces, and then the rest of the armor is basically straps and buckles to put the piece together. It's kind of goes on in layers. So you start with your feet, and then your shins for the greaves, and then your upper legs. Then you put the torso armor on, arm pieces, pauldrons for the shoulder, and helmet and gauntlets. So.
I don't know about you, Neil, but my experience wearing armor is that I always feel it in my shoulders most of all. Because that's sort of where all the weight hangs, because it's so much of it is suspended from the doublet, in addition to the torso armor as well, being suspended from the shoulders.
Yeah, I find for me, I think the suit fits me well, I guess, the one that I use, because, unless it's on wrong, then I feel it on the shoulders if they didn't strap it tight enough. That's the other thing. If it's not tight enough, it's a nightmare to wear. But I usually feel it on my feet because, you're just carrying that much extra weight on your body. So it's my feet that usually feel it after any length of time.
I think another sort of armor nerd fun fact that I hear a lot is like, well, if your suit is fitted right, it won't hurt that much on your shoulders, because that wasp waist is not only an aesthetic thing, but also, like a hiking backpack, distributes the weight to your hips as well. So you're not just feeling it all in your upper body.
No, that's very possible. I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that the best armor that's made today is perhaps equivalent to a medium level armor that was made back then. The craft has advanced a lot in terms of the reconstructions that are being done these days, but you can't compare like a handful, I mean, a handful is an exaggeration, but a very small number of practicing armorers around the world relative to whole streets full of armorers in every major city in Europe, whose ancestors had been armorers since time immemorial. These guys really knew what they were doing, and we should never overestimate our capacity to reproduce what they were able to do.
Also, quick plug for our YouTube page. I think that there's actually a clip of someone being laced into armor in our male armor video. So if you're curious about that, that's another good place for a visual to start.
Well, we're coming up on our hour and I feel like we've barely gotten into the meat of it. So let's ask one more question and then unfortunately we'll have to wrap it up, but perhaps we can re-invite the nerds of the round table another time. But our parting shot will be kind of a cross-cultural question. So why did Middle Eastern and South Asian societies never really adopt full plate armor despite coming in contact with it? So clearly there was a lot of technology exchange. Why did not armor follow?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely came into contact with it. We actually have an example of a cuirass that's a plate from the Deccan, so central South India, that shows its European influence. It even has like the anatomical decoration on that. But for a variety of reasons, it just would not be adaptable to the Middle East or especially South Asia. And some of the biggest reasons are climate. The climates are completely different when you go from North India to South India. You have snow up in Himachal Pradesh, for example, and then you have, trust me, I've been in South India, it's very hot. You have temperatures going up to like, cool 120 degrees. It gets really, really hot and humid. So you have to factor that in. The types of geography also vary from desert to very thick, dense forests, and also the types of warfare that they were employing. A lot of the types of warfare in South Asia, for example, and in the Middle East came by way of Central Asia, where you have these nomadic lifestyles. A lot of them were on horseback, and archery was a huge thing. So they needed something that was flexible, easy to wear, something that would allow for that adaptability of range and climate and geography. So that's why plate armor just did not take off there.
A lot of sense. Well, I hate to cut us off because I would
know,
love to
we're
hang
just
out
getting
with you
started.
forever. Love to do this
Need a
again
sequel.
sometime.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
yeah.
would say keep sending the Higgins your questions, even though we can't get to it in the session. This might inspire other sessions, maybe more content from the Higgins YouTube or Facebook to be able to answer these in the future. But I guess I will offer our goodbyes. And before you go, thanks to everyone who joined us today and for all your fantastic questions. And before you leave, I hope you'll consider making a gift to WAM this evening using the link in the video description. These donations support the museum, the collection, our educational programs, and so much more. And all donors who make a gift by 6 p.m. today will be invited to a virtual cocktail party with Erin Corrales Diaz, our Assistant Curator of American Art. Well, she'll give you a behind-the-scenes look at her upcoming exhibition, The Iconic Jersey, Baseball and Fashion. That starts at 6:30 tonight. And I just, again, want to thank you all so much for coming and for sharing in our love of arms and armor and all things medieval. I had so much fun with all 6 of you, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.